So it's lesson 6 this week. It's our weekend after Thanksgiving. It's a sunny Thursday, at least here in Barrie. And we're starting out today by doing just a little brainstorm about doing a little word association with the term web application security. So seeing a number of themes come out, people talking about protection, privacy, managing access, and authorization. We're dealing with things like password management, encryption, protecting data against hackers, dealing with online payments, absolutely, looking for vulnerabilities, protecting our data. So lots. Morning, Colton. Lots of things and that we're going to basically be tackling in this lesson and then again in lesson 8. Just jump out of my full screen view. So feel free to add anything else that comes to mind when we're thinking about web application security. So let's have a look at and I'll come back and refer to this, I think, a few times through the lesson today. Okay, so what are we doing today? We're going to talk about some of the fundamentals of web application security. We're going to have a look at the Oauth Project, which is probably new for a lot of you. This was brought to my attention by a former student who then graduated, went to work in the application security world, and he said, if you're not showing students what the Oauth Project is all about, you need to be. So we're going to take a few minutes to look at that. And then we're going to start to explore what kind of security infrastructure comes with ASP.NET. It's a suite of libraries called Identity. And Identity can sit in between the upper levels of our web app and our database to handle all of the authentication and authorization. So right now in our online store, everything is public. So we're going to use some of the tools in the Identity framework so we can implement, we're going to do it in 2 phases. First, we'll implement authentication, then we'll implement authorization. So we're going to start that this week, and then we will continue on with this 3 weeks from now, after our midterm exam and after reading week. Morning, Felix. Morning, Chris. Hope you guys are well. Thanks for joining today.
Good morning.
So next week, I do want to spend a couple minutes talking about the midterm exam. Okay. So our midterm exam will take place in class next Thursday. If you typically don't join the live WebEx sessions and you learn asynchronously, that's fine for the lessons, but this is scheduled as a synchronous class. You do need to write the midterm at 11 a.m. next Thursday. And you should be in the WebEx room because that way you can hear all the instructions for the exam and you have the opportunity to ask questions if you need to during the exam. The format of the exam, it is all practical. So I will either ask you to build something from scratch, or I may provide a starting project for you and ask you to make some changes to it. Okay? You will not need to deploy your site to Azure. I know a lot of people are having issues with Azure credits. We'll address those after reading week. So you will not need to deploy the site to Azure. I'll also ask everybody in the exam every 30 minutes, I'll turn on my mic and ask you to make a new commit to GitHub. So you should be committing to GitHub every 30 minutes through the test. And this helps me see your process during the exam. I will be sure to open the WebEx room by 10:50, so come early. And I will give out the instructions for the exam and make it available right at 11 a.m. I'll go over the instructions once. If you come in at like 11:10 or 11:15, you're on your own in terms of the instruction piece, because I'm only going to go through that one time. And the exam will have to be submitted by 2 o'clock. Morning, Jordan. Welcome. Does anybody have questions about the midterm? I will also say the format, I will say 2 other things. The format will be similar for the final exam, and there will be multiple versions of the exam. So not every student is going to be given the exact same set of requirements. Questions? Okay. Yes, Felix, basically, well, I guess next week is week 7. So pretty much anything we've covered in the course so far might be included, and that would include content from today's lesson. So anything we do in terms of authentication and authorization that we cover today could be included on the exam, yes. Yes, the exam, that's what I meant, sorry. When I said it's all practical, it is only a coding exam. There's no question and answer, multiple choice, or quiz portion. It is only a coding exam. And the final exam will be the same. So just to overview our next few weeks, so our midterm will be next week from 11 till 2. Then we'll have reading week on October the 28th. And then that first week of November, we will resume with our second lesson on authentication and authorization. That lesson is largely going to focus on implementing social authentication. So we're going to add the ability for users to sign into our online store with a Google login or a Microsoft login. And that process will be similar for both Google and Microsoft, but not exactly the same. So we will look at that. That's going to be what we'll do when we return after reading week. Any other questions about next week's exam? So just before we dive into ASP.NET Identity, and the details of doing web app implementing security measures in an ASP.NET site, I want to have a look at the Oauth project. Does anybody know what the Oauth project is, or anybody heard of this? Okay, nope, that's fine.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I can't vote.
I'm sorry?
I can't vote. Like, I visited Paul Everywhere. What's the first word you think of? And when I click on it, it's not.
Oh, okay, sorry. I think try it again now, Chris.
Okay.
I accidentally deactivated it. I didn't think I think somehow when I went out of full screen mode, I must have deactivated. I apologize. Try it now.
Thank you. I already did.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Yeah, so
Okay.
OWASP, thanks Fatima. It's the Open Web Application Security Project. So this is a not-for-profit project that's designed to improve the security of software in an open source manner. Okay. And the primary focus on the top 10 is every few years they publish the top 10 most common web security risks for web applications. So we can see here was the 2017 list. Here's the 2021 list. And how common are these things? And what's the point of this project? Well, if we read, the most common broken access control 94% of applications that they tested had some form of broken access control. So think how dangerous that is, considering how much of our lives now depend on web applications, right? We depend on the internet for everything. So if 94% of them have some form of broken access control, so what is broken access control? So the project describes each of these. There's their statistical analysis in their testing. So it describes what each one of these weaknesses are. So in broken access control, it means users are able to access resources outside of their permission level. So it describes the problem. It also describes a number of best practices as to how we can limit or minimize these things. So this is just related to web development as a whole. It's not necessarily related to ASP.NET in particular. Okay? So this is an excellent resource when we're building sites, because more and more, even though we're not, we're developers or designers, are not necessarily security professionals, implementing security still has to be part of what we do. And if we build web applications that aren't secure and those applications get compromised, people's data gets lost or published, then potentially we're liable. We're going to be held responsible, either legally or at least ethically and morally by our customers and our bosses. Now, a number of these vulnerabilities, a lot of them are addressed in ASP.NET by the identity framework. So it has a whole number of tools and measures to try to prevent a number of these attacks from happening. So we'll look at some of them. So this is just here for you as a reference. I've linked to it here. It's actually an excellent job interview question for a junior developer. What is the Oauth Project? So you should at least be familiar with what it is. So that link's here. We may come and refer to some things in here a bit later through the course. So let's have a look. Well, maybe I'm not going to PowerPoint you to death. I think they've only got 10 slides here, including my title slides, really only 9 slides. We'll just do a little bit of an overview. So what does this look like in our .NET project? So we've got our web application at the top. That's this kind of light blue component. We've got our SQL Server database, this gray component. And at the bottom, we've got communication. We've got traffic going back and forth, right? We can create, read, edit, and delete. We can interact with our database. So there's two primary libraries, two different dependencies that come in our project that we're going to use. This green one here is called the Identity Core Library. And this has two prime features: user management and role management. And then underneath that sits a second identity library called Identity.Entity Framework. So this is the class that interacts with the database. So it allows us to store in the database, to send in users and roles, and also retrieve them for implementing security. So we're going to start implementing some security measures in our pet store. What we're going to do is largely based on this tutorial series from Microsoft. So I've taken this tutorial series. I've linked to it in these PowerPoint slides. They're on Blackboard right here in lesson 6 for you to reference. So if you want to see the tutorial, so this was updated very recently, just last month. So it starts from the very basics of creating a brand new application and then implementing the identity framework for security. So all this stuff is here for you as a reference. So I've sort of adapted what's here so we can include it into the project we're already building. So we're going to implement both authentication and authorization in our project. Again, really common job interview question for a junior developer. What's the difference between authentication and authorization? They are related, but they're not exactly the same. So how would you define these two and explain the difference? And if you're not sure, feel free to guess. I'm confident somebody in the class has some ideas. All right, that's great, David. That's a really simple, non-technical. Yep, Colton, that's right. So David says, who someone is authentication versus what they are allowed to do, which is authorization. As Colton says, yep, checking what you can do. So that's the authorization versus who you are. Exactly. So visually, here's our representation. So our authentication is around user identity. Who is this person or who is this user? How do we identify them? What's their username and what kind of authentication type are we using? Is there a username and password in our own database? Is there a third party, something like a Microsoft, Facebook, Google account? So those are different authentication types or authentication schemes. So authentication is the first level. And for those of you who are in the web program and you were in my PHP class in the winter semester, we implemented authentication in our PHP application where users had to register and log in order to be able to create, update, or delete data. So that's kind of level one, is authentication. So do we know who the user is, or are they just some anonymous user that we can't identify? The second level is the authorization. First, we identify you. You authenticate somehow, typically by a login, with a login, but it could be done in other ways, could be with an authentication token or something else. Once we know who you are, the authorization is then what level of permission, what type of user are you? So what role or roles do you belong to? What kind of membership do you have? And that determines what you're allowed to do. So the identity framework uses this principal object. It basically stores a user identity along with the roles that that user has. I'm just going to pause for 1 second. I just have to go open my garage door for someone who's showing up to do some work. Bear with me. Sorry about that. So we're going to implement both of these things in our project. We're going to start with just dealing with authentication. So we want to let authenticated users see and do things that anonymous users cannot see or do. That's going to be number one. After we get that working, we're going to add a few roles to our database, and then we're going to refactor that code to implement authorization so that different users can see and do different things, right? We can see this even within Blackboard. We can see authorization at work. If you look at your week 6 folder on Blackboard, there are a number of cues here. There's a whole lot of authorization checks, right? What can you see when I share my screen? What do you see here that would indicate there's a bunch of authorization logic on this page? If you look at my version of the week 6 folder, look at your own version, you should see some things that are different. Okay, so yeah, I've got the ability, for example, I've got edit mode, right? So there's got to be a logic check here that shows or hides this little area based on our user roles. If I'm in the instructor role, I see it. You're in the student role, you don't. Hey, Shorten, what else is different about my version of this page? It's the same page. We're looking at the same URL. What else is different besides this little edit mode? Yeah, so I've got this menu here. This is how I put stuff on here. I can go ahead and I've got access, thanks to Sharp, to create new content, right? Anything else you can see on my screen that you don't see on the same version? I can actually see it the same way you do. Yeah, I've got this control panel. So I can add content to the course. I've got a bunch of tools here. I can set up, I can see who's been logging in, who's been completing assignments. I've got the grade center. So I've got a whole bunch of options. So everywhere that we see elements that are different between your version of this page and mine, there's authorization checks in the background. There's a whole lot of if statements that show or hide different components depending on the user role. Now, this page also, in fairness, it also has a basic authentication check. So if I grab the URL here and go to a private window where I'm not signed in, if I try and load this same URL, right, it denies me access because it doesn't know who I am. So it's first doing authentication. It's making sure I have a valid login and I have the right to access the page at all. And then within that, once I'm identified and authenticated, then virtually every page in Blackboard still has those authorization checks. So it knows what components to show and what components to hide, depending on who the user is and what they are allowed to do. So we've all experienced both authentication and authorization many times from the end user perspective, but today we're going to implement those things from the developer's side of things. So we got a bunch of tables, right? When we created our project in Visual Studio and we chose individual accounts for authentication, then I'm actually going to we can open up our pet store. Might as well open it up. So when we created the project, I'm like, Beneficent, right? Under our, close some stuff up here. So in our project, when we created it, in the data folder, we got this migration, started with a whole prefix with a whole bunch of zeros, called create identity schema. So this built a bunch of tables in the database for us that will be used for managing users and roles, for doing authentication and authorization. So we got 6 tables. They start with the prefix ASP.NET, and there's a bunch of relationships between them. So we can use these tables for managing the users and roles. We don't have to create our own. We're just going to leverage this existing infrastructure. So there's a few basic classes we're going to be working with. For authentication, we're going to be working with a class called Identity User. And those user accounts get stored in the ASP.NET Users table. The class for managing authorization is called Identity Role, and it's mapped to the ASP.NET User Roles table. So if we look, I'll just zoom in here for a minute. So ASP.NET Users will store the user accounts. ASP.NET Roles will store the roles. So in Blackboard, the roles would be things like student, faculty, administrator, for example. And there's a many-to-many relationship here. One user can actually be in more than one role, and one role can have many users. So we've got this intermediate, this junction table, ASP.NET User Roles, that stores one user and one role. Because, for example, I might be both an administrator and a faculty member. So I would have two records in this table. So we're going to need to make a few changes, which we'll do shortly in our startup file. The code that's here in black is already here. The code that's in blue are things we're either going to change or things we're going to add into our project. And then we'll look at, with a single line, how we can control access to either a controller or individual method. Or we could say a specific method is public. And then if inside of our view, we want to show or hide something, depending on whether our user is logged in or not, we can use a simple check like this. If our user.identity is authenticated, that means if they've logged in or not. And then later on, we're going to add the authorization checks. So we're going to restrict access based on the user's role. So today we're going to wind up creating a couple of user accounts. We're going to create an administrator account, and we're going to create a customer account. And those two users will be in different roles. And by the end of class today, they'll be able to see and do different things. So we're going to start with the authentication part, and then we'll finish with the authorization, sort of that second level of security over and above the basic authentication. So let's get our project running. So you can open your project up. I think I'm just going to close all my tabs because I got a million tabs open. So I'm just going to get my project running for starters. So we get our pet store, which we themed last week. We had our categories. We also have our pets. So let's do a few things here. First of all, one thing we should have done last week, we didn't. We have no way to actually get to the pets section of the site, right? Categories, we have this link here, but our nav bar, we probably want a link for pets as well. So let's go ahead and add that. We can go to our layout file. I could add a new link here, but really, we don't even really need this link that says home, because the positive pets, the page title, this is already our home link. So what I'm going to do is move this link over here and just change it from home to pets. And yes, I do have to remember I did get a few logo submissions for our pet store. I said we'd have a little vote, so we will do that later today. So I'm going to go into views and shared and open up the layout. So I'm going to take this first list item that has the home link. I'm actually going to move it down underneath the categories link. So I'll just move it down here. And then I'm going to modify the controller, ASP controller, as well as the text in the link. Instead of the controller being home, I want the controller to be pets. And instead of the link text saying home, I also want it to be pets. So our links, besides our logo, now are categories first, pets are second. So now I've got home, categories, pets. So our next step is we want to create a user account. So we want to make, and we've got a built-in page to do this. I go here and click on register. We've actually got a built-in registration page. We've also got a built-in login page. We've got built-ins for forget password. We won't need the email confirmation. So this page is actually functional, but we need to make one change to the project setup in order before we can actually create an account. So we're going to create an administrator account in just a minute, but one change first. So in my Solution Explorer, I'm going to go and open up the very last file, which is called startup.cs. This is an auto-generated file. I'm going to open it up. So all of this code was written by Visual Studio when we created the project. We have not done anything in this file. There's one small thing we want to change. On line 35, if you have a look here, anybody want to take a guess what option we should probably change here? I know the code isn't something you totally exactly know, but you can probably assume what's happening here. We want to make a small change. What should we change? So line 35 is configuring our site for authentication to manage users. What's happening in the code I've highlighted in blue? Yeah, it's going to be sending an email, trying to send an email so that a new account will not be active until a user responds to a verification email and clicks the link there. By default, notice this value is enabled. It's set to true. We don't actually have a mail server right now running that we can use to send email. So we want to turn this feature off. Otherwise, when we create a new account, it's not going to be active. And we don't have the email server that we need to do this. So on line 35, that last value of true, we just want to change that to false. So we want somebody to be able to register, and for now, we are disabling any email confirmation requirement. And now that we've done that, we can actually try out the registration and login pages that Visual Studio gave us. So we're going to create an administrator account for simplicity, and so that you don't all everybody have to remember password. We are all going to use the exact same login. So our login, our username will be admin@gc.ca. And there's a bunch of validations baked into this. So for example, if I put in a password that's one character, it tells me minimum of 6. Again, we could override that, but there's validation here. There's password checking as well. So for the password, I'm going to put the login in the chat. We're going to use admin@gc.ca. And for the password, let's show it up on the screen here. We're going to use admin@gc.ca, and our password will be capital T, lowercase est, 123 $. Because the rules are going to require a strong password. So minimum of 1 uppercase, 1 lowercase, 1 digit, and 1 special character. I'm going to recommend we all use the same password. That way no one has to remember it. That's interesting, Chris. I'm not sure why that would be. it may, Chris, you can try to hit the register button and you may get the message after. So I'm going to go ahead and register and click register. Let's see what happens.
Well, it says this app does not currently have a real email sender registered.
I just registered that account and then it showed up for yours as this account is registered. So I think I just,
Are you connected to my database?
oh God, I might be.
Okay, so yeah, if you're using my code from GitHub, you may be connected to my Azure database. That will be somewhat problematic. So I would recommend that you use your own database. And it can be a local database, doesn't have to run on Azure. So Chris, if it doesn't give you the warning, it won't give you the warning unless you're violating the rules. If you're following the rules, there'll be no warning. Okay, so it says this is already taken. So I'm going to go and look in my database. And if I look in the ASP.NET users table, I can select, oops, that's my local database. I'm not connected to my local database, I'm connected to Azure. So I will go check my Azure database. And in ASP.NET users. So I've got one user account. You can see the ID is this long random string. It uses the GUID class. My password is hashed. And we have not enabled two-factor authentication. So I've got one user account here. And if I look, I should now be able to go and log in. So I'll click on the login. I'll try out the login page. And when I log in, it says hello, and it puts in my email address, and I get log out. And the links to register and log in, those both get hidden when I'm logged into the site. So if you got an error, Chris, the error you mentioned about trying to send the email, make sure in the startup file, you change this property from true to false. Because when it's set to true, which is the default, it's going to try and send an email. We don't have a server for that.
I changed it to false.
Okay, and you saved, and you still get that error?
Let's see. Oh yeah, I still have the error. It's still working normal. The registration password thing is normal now.
Okay.
And also,
I may have to look at it after.
Okay.
I probably have to see what's happening.
Okay.
So now I'm logged in. So let's try really basic authentication. Let's make it so a user has to be logged in order to access anything in the categories controller. So if I go to my controllers and open up the categories controller, now I can require authentication for any individual method here, or if I want all of these methods to require authentication, I can do it at the class level. So here on line 13, here's our class. So we'll say make all controller available only to authenticated users. So all I need to add here is one line of code. I'll add an annotation in square brackets of authorize. That makes this whole controller file private. So somebody who's logged into the site can access it, but somebody who's not logged in cannot. Now, when we do this, Visual Studio complains because we need to add a reference here. So I'm going to use the code hinter. We need to add a reference to Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Authorization. So I'm going to accept that reference. Gets added on my line 5. And now we can go and try this out and see how it works. So I'm logged into the site, so I can browse around, which is fine. I'm going to copy the link to my home page and then go to a different browser. So I'll go to Chrome. So notice I'm not logged in Chrome, right? I see register and login. I don't see the hello and my username. So I can go to pets, I can go to the home page, but when I go to categories, now much like I did when I tried to go to the Blackboard page in my private browser, I get redirected off to the login. And I can't go anywhere in the categories controller. I go to categories/create or categories/edit and put in a category ID. I'm locked out from everything in here. Now there's one place. So controlling access at the controller level, it's really easy. One line of code at the top. Blocks all anonymous users. There is, however, one place in here. One of the methods in the controller we want to make public. So we basically want to override the authentication check. Which method, create, edit, details, or delete, which one do you think would be safe for us to let an anonymous user get to? Create, edit, details, or delete? Here's create, index, edit, delete, and details. So one of these pages, we could allow anonymous users to see. Which one?
Rich, I think maybe you can't see chat again.
Thank you. Yes, I need to scroll down. Appreciate that. Thanks, Colton. Yes, Colton and Fatima, Jordan, and Ralph. Yeah, the details. So let's override it so that at least someone can see the details, but they can't make changes. So if I go down in my controller, here on line 32, there's our details method. So here we can say allow anonymous. So that's going to make the details method only basically overrides just like a variable scope. The local scope for authorization is the closest one. The lowest scale takes precedence over something at a larger or broader scope. So everything else in the controller is still private, but this one method is now public. Make this method only public, since users can't change anything here. So if I try this in Chrome now, if I go to categories, which I need to spell right, /details, and put in an ID number, that exists, I can still get here now. I know it's a little bit of a contrived example because the user's not going to type this URL, but I wanted to show how that allow anonymous works. If I click edit, when I'm anonymous, right, then I get sent to log in. If I try and go back to the category index, nope, can't go anywhere except to the details. So we could control at a very granular level which pages are private and which ones are public. Now we should do one other thing in terms of the security for the categories. And again, we'll get to authorization in the next part of class, just thinking authentication. Our user's anonymous or our user is authenticated. What one other thing should we do, which we can do with just 1 or 2 lines of code, in terms of protecting the categories in our website? Okay, yeah, we could hide edit here. That's true. We could do that. There's something else I think we should hide. There's one other element that's visible that should be visible here when I'm logged in, but probably shouldn't be visible here when I'm anonymous. What else should be hidden? Yeah, exactly, Jordan. We probably should hide these links for an anonymous user, but show them to an authenticated user. So we can add a little bit of logic in the layout file by wrapping our 2 links in an if statement. That's exactly what we're going to do. So underneath my UL class, which was on line 26, I'm going to write a little if statement here. So if our user.identity.is authenticated, and then a set of curly braces. So this will tell us if the user is logged in or not. Doesn't tell us their role or permission, just tells us, are they currently logged in? Yes or no. So now an authenticated user is going to see these 2 links, but an anonymous user won't see them. And we shouldn't be giving links to people who shouldn't have access to the pages that they target. So wrap those 2 list items inside of your if statement. So now I am still logged in here with my admin account. So all is good. And in Chrome, right, I don't even see those links now. If I log out, my links should disappear. If I log back in, the links reappear. So we needed very, very little code to do this. Really just these 3 features. Authorize to restrict access, allow anonymous to override any access restrictions, and then in our views, we can just check if our user identity is authenticated, yes or no. So we can determine what we should show a particular user on our site based on if they've logged in or if they haven't. All right, so our authentication, put this stuff up on GitHub. Our authentication piece was actually relatively simple. We only put in a couple lines of code, only needed a couple lines in order to get this to work. So this is lesson 6.1. So this will be our basic. So I'm going to push those changes. I'm going to pause the recording. I need to take a quick break and step away for a few minutes. We will return in 10 minutes. So the code changes that we've made, they are on GitHub now if you need to reference them. We'll come back just after